At 600 local time, Russia's most feared European fortress officially collapsed into a geopolitical prison. In a desperate bid to sustain his grinding war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin ordered the near-total evacuation of Kaliningrad, draining the exclave of 80% of its elite troops, including the formidable 11th Army Corps and critical S-400 air defense batteries. What was once an impregnable spearhead deep inside NATO territory is now abandoned, defenseless, and completely cut off. Operation Baltic isolation has turned Putin's crown jewel into a helpless island surrounded by enemies. Here is the full tactical breakdown of how Kaliningrad fell without a single shot being fired. Deep inside the once heavily fortified exclave, the withdrawal happened with ruthless speed. Russian commanders, under direct orders from Moscow, loaded troop transports and rail cars with the best units stationed in Kaliningrad. The 11th Army Corps, battle-hardened mechanized infantry, artillery regiments, and Iskander missile brigades pulled out in waves, leaving behind skeleton crews of conscripts and local militia. Advanced S-400 Triumph missile systems, once the pride of Kaliningrad's air defenses capable of tracking and engaging targets hundreds of kilometers away, were dismantled and shipped east to cover losses in Ukraine. Airfields that once hosted Su-30SM fighters and MiG-31 interceptors now sat eerily quiet, hangars empty, runways overgrown with weeds. The Baltic fleet's forward bases in Baltic retained only a handful of aging corvettes and patrol boats. Putin had bet everything on Ukraine, and in doing so, he had stripped Kaliningrad naked. NATO sensed the vulnerability immediately and moved to lock the gates permanently. Poland, sharing the southern border, announced the accelerated construction of a massive $2.5 billion steel and concrete barrier. A modern dragon's teeth wall reinforced with smart sensors, anti-drone netting, and rapid response fortifications. Polish Army engineering brigades worked around the clock under floodlights, pouring foundations, erecting 10-meter-high steel panels, and laying minefields and anti-tank ditches along the entire frontier. Lithuanian forces on the northern and eastern flanks took even more aggressive steps. They severed the critical rail and road lifelines that had kept Kaliningrad supplied with fuel, food, and spare parts. Electricity interconnectors from Lithuania were switched off, plunging parts of the exclave into rolling blackouts. Natural gas pipelines were shut down, forcing residents to rely on dwindling stockpiles and expensive imported coal. The tactical isolation was total. Kaliningrad, sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania with the Baltic Sea as its only uncertain lifeline, had become a landlocked prison. Russian supply ships attempting to reach Baltic were now shadowed 24/7 by NATO warships and maritime patrol aircraft. Any attempt to reinforce by sea faced immediate interception under Article 5 readiness protocols. The once mighty exclave that had threatened NATO's entire northern flank with Iskander missiles and Bastion coastal defense systems was reduced to a hollow shell. Russian air cover was gone. Ground forces capable of mounting any serious defense numbered in the low thousands, mostly demoralized garrison troops with outdated equipment. Inside Kaliningrad itself, the human and economic collapse accelerated at shocking speed. Over 150,000 citizens, nearly a third of the population, began a mass exodus. Families packed whatever they could carry into cars and overloaded buses, heading toward the few remaining crossing points before they too were shut down. Shops emptied of basic goods. Hospitals reported shortages of medicine and fuel for generators. Factories that once supported the Russian military-industrial complex ground to a halt without parts and power. Black markets flourished while official stores stood empty. The local economy, heavily dependent on military spending and transit trade, entered freefall. Unemployment skyrocketed as soldiers' families lost their primary income. Crime rates surged as desperate residents turned to smuggling and theft. Russian state television tried to spin the situation as a strategic redeployment, but the images of long lines at border crossings and empty military bases told a different story. From a tactical standpoint, the loss of Kaliningrad represents one of the greatest self-inflicted strategic disasters in modern Russian history. The exclave had been Moscow's unsinkable aircraft carrier in Europe, a forward base from which Russia could threaten the Suwalki Gap, strike deep into Poland, and dominate the southeastern Baltic Sea. Now that advantage has evaporated. NATO forces in Poland and the Baltic states can operate with near total freedom. American and allied F-35 squadrons based in the region face no meaningful air defense threat. Ground forces can mass along the borders without fear of sudden Iskander barrages. The Baltic Sea, once contested waters, is rapidly becoming a NATO lake. Supply lines for any future Russian operations in the region are severed. Kaliningrad has transformed from an offensive dagger into a massive liability, a besieged territory that Russia cannot easily resupply or reinforce. The psychological impact on Putin's regime is equally devastating. The silent fall of Kaliningrad signals to the world that Russia's military is stretched beyond breaking point. Allies in Belarus and further afield watch nervously as Moscow prioritizes one failing front at the expense of another. Inside Russia, questions grow louder about the wisdom of the Ukraine campaign that has left the western flank completely exposed. For NATO, the situation is a gift. Planners in Brussels and Washington now game out scenarios where Kaliningrad could be neutralized or even occupied with minimal resistance in any future conflict. The $2.5 billion Polish wall is only the beginning. New air defense batteries, long-range artillery, and rapid reaction forces are being positioned to keep the exclave permanently contained. As winter approaches, the suffering inside Kaliningrad deepens. Power outages lengthen. Food prices soar. The remaining population huddles in cold apartments, watching Russian flags fly over increasingly empty military bases. The great fortress that once terrified Europe has become a geopolitical prison. Isolated, starving, and irrelevant. Putin's desperate gamble in Ukraine has cost him one of his most valuable strategic assets, possibly forever. The transformation is complete. Kaliningrad, once Russia's proud outpost on the Baltic, now stands as a monument to imperial overreach. Surrounded by hostile NATO territory, stripped of its defenders, and economically strangled, it has become a helpless island in a sea of enemies. The tactical breakdown is clear. By draining Kaliningrad to feed the meat grinder in Ukraine, Putin did not strengthen his position. He created a massive vulnerability that NATO has already begun to exploit. The gates are locked, the walls are rising, and the once feared fortress is dying a slow, humiliating death. Russia's European stronghold has fallen, not to invading armies, but to its own strategic blindness. The balance of power in the Baltic has shifted permanently. And the world is watching as Putin's empire continues to shrink, one abandoned outpost at a time. Operation Baltic Isolation is not just a military withdrawal. It is the beginning of the end of Russia's forward posture in Europe. Kaliningrad is trapped, and it may never escape.